I will repeat my warm welcome. It's lovely to see you all here, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. The session is being recorded, as Gemma had just mentioned. I should also thank Taylor and Francis, the publisher, because they have sponsored this award. And I should also say what a great pleasure it was to, be involved in editing the journal, and once again this annual prize session that we have in terms of reviewing the content for the year amongst the members of the national board, and then making an initial selection. Everybody is asked to nominate 2 articles, and from that we drill down, and then we each take votes and make a decision around, awarding a prize to both a winner and a runner-up. So it's fascinating having that reminder once again of the content that's appeared in print for a given year. So just to give everybody a sense of the format for the session, what we're going to do is we will have a short presentation from the authors of the 2 articles, who've been asked to kind of share and present an overview of their publication, and maybe include some reflections on, the publication, given the distance of time between writing and the today's date, as it were. And each of those presentations will last 10 minutes, and they will be presented back to back. And then we're going to move forward to a slot where we have time for discussants. And so these questions have been shared with the authors. And we have 2 discussants with us today. We have Becky Morris and Marion Bowl, and they have shared some questions that they'd asked the authors to reflect on, and they will be taken piece by piece in terms of the different authors addressing the questions. And then we will open the session out to the floor for a broader question and answer session. So we have short presentations of 10 minutes moving through from the different authors, then 15 minutes each for focused questions from the 2 discussants, and then the wider discussion with the audience in general. So we'll be opening up to the floor at that point. So taking the articles in order, I am going to now ask Anina to present in relation to the winning article, which was authored by Anina Hessel and Steve Strand. And their title is Proficiency in English is a better predictor of educational achievement than English as an additional language. So very important piece of research here. So over to you, Anina, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. Well, it's an honor to present today with all of you here. Yeah, so the title says it. We are interested in predicting educational achievement. And in particular, we worked on predicting or looking at the relationship between linguistic heterogeneity and how well students do at school. So the old question, who's going to need more support and who's going to fly through? And there is a traditional way of looking at linguistic diversity in England, which is asking whether a student is learning English only at home or English as an additional language, which means they would be learning another language, very often Arabic, for example, besides English. And that's the case for a lot of people around the world. In England, for example, it would be 1 in 5 students. And it's quite important because it is on people's minds. It's used to target funding, and very often it's also used to target teaching. But we all know that students within this group have a large diversity again, because you can learn 2 languages in many different ways. And the hypothesis that is also not super new, but we picked it up, is the idea that English proficiency is the key to understanding how actually bilingualism, or being an EAL learner, links to how well you do at school. The underlying reasoning is that language is a key learning tool, We all learn from listening to people, from reading books, from picking up things through language. And it's even been shown that language is also used to rehearse, for example. So that's important. And at the same time, academic language is hard to learn. It's not the same that you hear on the school ground or in your everyday life. Very happily, in the years 2017 and 2018, a national teacher rating for language proficiency was actually introduced in the national census, which I sum up as imperfect yet very important. And I'll just show you, just to give you an idea. It was 5 levels, and I'll just give you the endpoints. So we had the lowest level, which was new to English. So important here, I'd say, is may understand some very everyday expressions, minimal or no literacy in English, needs considerable amount of support. So that would be someone who recently arrived, is new to English, as it says, to fluent, which would mean equivalent or uses English as his or equivalent to someone who uses English as his or her first language. So this is a comparison to the monolingual learner. So basically someone where you don't see from the way they use language that it isn't their only language. And so teachers were asked to rate on this scale. I'll get back to how this could be improved. Many people have thought about that, but it was a really good start because it quantifies this diversity that's always been there but not accounted for. And what we wanted to do was to provide a first direct comparison between the EL status and what this rating of proficiency told us about students, and to see how much does it actually explain about student success? And we asked 2 very specific questions. First of all, how much does this proficiency rating done by teachers predict in EL students' achievement? So how much can we actually explain of how well they're going to be doing later in life? And is the rating a better predictor of all students' attainment than just comparing them or dividing them into EAL and monolingual learner? For that, we asked for the national pupil database. Unfortunately, we did not get it. So we went through local authorities, contacting them, asking them to share their data. And we were very fortunate because a number of them did share a considerable amount of data. And we got 140,000 students from a quite a representative sample, different kinds of local authorities represented there. And we asked for the data from 5 to 16 years of age, so the whole way through, which is based on the fact that we asked for data from all national assessments from the earliest, from the reception years up to the very end, 16. So those were the measures of educational attainment, or just school success, as you could say. And then we also asked for student background variables. 3 key ones that are very important or known to be important in general for student success. One being free school meal entitlement, here shortened to FSM. It's just basically a proxy, a way of getting at students' socioeconomic background, knowing how much wealth is in the family, very broadly put. Then we have gender, ethnicity, and then the 2 ones that are important for linguistic heterogeneity, EAL status, and the proficiency in English rating done by teachers that I showed you, the 5-level one. For the analyses, we went for mixed effect models, hierarchical mixed models, you can also call them. The reason being that the data was nested. Obviously, a student does not come as an individual, they come as part of a school community, and the school is part of a neighborhood and part of a local authority. So to account for that, we included random variables, they're called, for schools and local authorities, and then also the fixed variables. So that would be something like the student's gender. And for the model building, we went for stepwise model building. So that means that first we lay the ground of the gender, school, local authority, everything in there. And then we added the linguistic diversity measures, so EAL status and proficiency rating. And that allowed us to compare how well the models were doing in predicting student achievement, and also how much they could actually predict in how well students are going to do or are doing at school. So now to the results. This is related to the first research question. I walk you through it. So here on the bar charts, you see on the left side the Key Stage 2 reading, and on the right side, Key Stage 4 attainment age. So this would be at 11 years of age. This would be at 16 years of age. The different bar charts, they go from new to English. So remember the ones where it says minimal to no literacy, for example, up to fluent. So all the way through the proficiency rating. And what you can see very nicely here is that with higher English proficiency also come higher scores on this national assessment. And even that the fluent students, the fluent EL students, they performed above national average, which is the line that you see here. Okay, now that might not be surprising because obviously it's a reading assessment, but looking at attainment 8, you can also see that this is also true across other subjects at the age 16. And I think what's quite remarkable is that there is a real progression, like it's almost like going up steps, right? It's a super clear picture that we get here of the link between proficiency and student attainment. And then here, which it's also very nice to see the difference that it makes to add this English proficiency rating to the other background predictors. So we have again the variance explained up here. And this is now going from reception, so age 5, up to age 16. So you basically see all the students across the different grades. And the lower bar, the white one, is always all the other background measures. So that would be gender, ethnicity, free school meals, which are actually quite big and important predictors, but they're really pale compared to adding English proficiency in. So this is the gray bar here. And I think it shows very nicely how important really language is for student success at school. Now that was the how much it can explain. And just to sum up, I think what we could find was the clear support for the English proficiency rating being really, really important. It really showed how much variance was explained in achievement, especially compared to gender and ethnicity. And it also showed that there was more support needed, or there is more support needed in language-heavy subjects, as it was a better predictor for reading in English. But support is needed across the curriculum. For example, it considerably predicted mathematics too, and I think that's not surprising for everybody who teaches math. Obviously, you still use language doing it. They have text that they have to read, and so on. Now to the comparison, because we didn't only want to know, does it explain a lot, but we also wanted to know, is it actually better than what we have so far? Because there is something there to measure linguistic heterogeneity. And now I don't have nice figures to show you for this, so you have to trust me in that. But there are tables in the article that obviously great to look at. So the proficiency rating was significantly better in predicting achievement than the EL status. That was true for all models that we tested from age 5 to 16 across all subjects. It was a very clear picture again that we got there. In all ways that you can compare models, they were better. And that shows again that English proficiency is, or supports the idea rather, that English proficiency is the key mediator between exposure, so that would be the EAL status, right? How much language English do you get at home? And then the achievement that you later on see in the school. Now, as far as implications go, we do urge, and I still think it is a good idea. I actually do it as a teacher myself, and I recommend it to everybody else. It is really good to collect the proficiency data in schools yourself, so you actually know where to target support. I also think it would be really good to reintroduce the English proficiency rating in the national census, because it's not only important for me as an individual teacher to know how I can support my students, but actually it's important for school system on a whole to have that knowledge. It's also lacking in Germany, by the way. We've been trying to do secondary data analysis with colleagues at the University of Cologne, and I wish there was more information that we could build on. Well, I've mentioned before that the rating has been important but imperfect, and there have been a few suggestions made, and I'll just summarize a few key points. It would be really good to base it on observable behavior, so things you can see in language actions, rather than comparing it to social norms, so too monolingual. Which goes hand in hand with the next point. It would be really important to assess monolingual learners too. I think everybody knows that monolingualism does not mean you're great at academic language. It's not the same thing. And the most important thing, teachers need support in using the results for teaching, because the test is only as good as how the results can be used to support student learning. So that's all I had to say, except for thanks. Big thanks to local authorities who share the data, Bell Foundation, Unbound Philanthropy for the financial support, and obviously all of you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Anina. That was a wonderful presentation and a wonderful walkthrough and summary of your findings. Really accessible. Thank you so much. Could I ask you to stop sharing your screen now, and we'll pass across to Louise and Jenny, who are going to share with us an overview of their article.
It's been a while since I've used Zoom. I'll get there. I'll stop sharing soon.
Don't worry, don't worry. Thank you.
Hang on, has it been replaced? It tells me it's...
It has
good.
been replaced, yeah.
Is our video our PowerPoint now showing?
It is, Jenny. You may want to go to the slide one, as it were. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but at the moment we can see the screen.
I think if you hit F5, Jenny, it should do it to full screen.
Oh,
Right.
thank you. For me, it's on full screen. Hang on. Did the F5 make a difference or not?
No.
It didn't. It might be within slideshow, might it?
Okay, let me do that.
From beginning to the left.
Ah, there we
Yeah,
go.
there we are. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you for the technical advice. So kia ora everybody, I'm Jenny Ritchie, and my colleague Louise Phillips will introduce her shortly. And our article, which was the runner-up article, was called Learning with Indigenous Wisdom in a Time of Multiple Crises, Embodied and Emplaced Early Childhood Pedagogies. So we're going to just briefly, because of time, talk about the context for our study, a little of the content, and some of the considerations. So our study was funded by the Spencer Foundation of Chicago, and they had a particular fund focused on civic action. And they had yet to see any studies focused on civic action with young children. So we gathered our data ethnographically in 2 early childhood centres. One was here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the other was inland from within Queensland in Australia. Louise will talk about that. And both of us had long-term relationships in our respective communities, and we engaged with the local teachers as co-researchers and writers. And that was kind of key to our methodology, really, was the relationality.
Shall I jump? Sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, sure.
To contribute further back to that. So Jingari, greetings from Yugambeh country. It's where I'm located now. And perhaps to give some examples in there so that you understand that, Indigenous peoples are the most, researched population, and the research has been colonizing and quite abusive. So the long-term relationships, were so important. And for example, in the context that the community that I worked with, it was about a year of building the relationship. So, I was invited in by an Aboriginal person, not from that community, but had worked with that community. And then over time, multiple meetings, it was probably about the third or fourth meeting time I visited the community that the teachers at the Early Learning Centre took me to go and visit parents to get their permission, and then to the community elder to get permission for research in the project. And then, of course, getting consent from the children as well was a slow process in building trust.
And also Louise, I remember visiting the centre with Louise, and how she just sat with the child and went through some of the videos she'd taken with the child and asked that child, would it be okay to share one of those videos in a forthcoming presentation, so that the ethical consent was an ongoing process throughout the study rather than just a rubber stamping at the start. So just a little more on our context. We're both Pākehā or white settler activist scholars, and we both focus on social, cultural and ecological justice. And we also critique the hegemony of adultism, which reflects the patriarchal, hierarchical, anthropocentric and humanist paradigm that has contributed to the current polycrisis of climate, COVID, conflict and consequent impacts. We're seeing in Aotearoa some really extreme impacts from climate, extreme weather, accelerating environmental degradation, increasing economic and social disparities and dislocation of families. The UNICEF has talked about the polycrisis in which the world finds itself, multiple simultaneous shocks with strong interdependencies being intensified in an ever more integrated world. So in recognising the onslaughts of all these various overlapping waves of colonisation for Indigenous people, industrialisation, capitalism, neoliberalism and globalisation, we now see the manifestation of many complexly interrelated wicked problems. And unfortunately, the hegemonic externalizing of nature by the anthropocentric humanist Western paradigm deters analysis of the interconnectedness and human complicity in these problems. So a key task for education scholars committed to addressing these problems is therefore to illuminate pathways for unlearning such hegemonies.
So with our deep connections, relationships with Māori and Aboriginal Australian communities, we really see that there's such profound wisdom to learn from. And what we understand from our lengthy times with the communities is this interrelationality, so that every member is respected of the community, and there's that awareness that of not just being an individual, but being part of a group, a community, and not just with people, but with all living entities. So this is this ecological milieu, that there's this interdependency between all living entities. That whole worldview we see has such importance. If we could shift everyone to have that attitude, we see that there's greater hope for the future of our planet. And so we will now provide some illustrative examples of that at play within the early childhood centres that we spent time with. And it was deep ethnographic work of hanging out and being part of the community that our observations and stories come from. And so that we see, as I said, that this is of such great value for the planetary well-being if we take on these worldviews. We go to the
You can
next
see.
slide. Yeah.
But just at the bottom there, you know, we just really recognizing children as the key players in their worlds and capable of not just individual but collective action in service of their communities and of planetary well-being. And one further thing is that from a Māori perspective, it's not just all living creatures, but for Māori, what Westerners might think as inanimate objects like rivers and mountains, they're also considered ancestors, actually. So they are part of the cosmology of interrelatedness, which stems from the relationship we all have with the Earth Mother and the Sky Father, and we are all descendants of the Earth Mother and the Sky Father. So it's quite a different cosmological, ontological positioning.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's the same in Aboriginal Australian ontology. So when I'm saying living, that they see that the river is living because it is, yeah, alive in the earth as well, because they're constantly changing and transforming. So here's an example from an infants and toddlers room in an Aboriginal Australian governed childcare centre that the research comes from. And Bina is an educator, and she is a co-author in the book from the project as well. So we saw that was important, that their voices were foregrounded. So Bina's sitting in the middle of the room, and she has Talara and Daran, so they're about 7 to 9 months, kind of leaning and climbing on her, whilst two toddlers, Teddy and Jara, are walking around the room, and Latala is laying in a cot drinking her bottle. So there's 5 children she's taking responsibility of already. And Jara's then went over and sat in the chair next to the cot and started to pat Latala, and Latala reaches through the bars of the cot. So having the cot within the playroom, so children are sleeping in the room as well as playing, which may be different to, say, an English childcare centre. So that sense of everyone being together is so important. And then Jara stood up on the chair. Bina recognised that could be dangerous, so said, "Sit down, Jara," and he followed. Teddy stood on the edge of her foam mattress and was bouncing. And Bina says, "Jump, Teddy, jump." And he steps off with a big smile. And he enthusiastically repeated this a few times. And then Bardo, Sabina's 9-year-old son, was visiting and laying on another mattress. And he called to Teddy, who toddled over with his arms wide open and fell into this warm embrace. And then Coco, an educator from a neighbouring room, comes and visits it and cuddles her daughter. And earlier, her brother had also visited. So there's this lovely intergenerational relationality alive constantly in these the community of just this one little room in this childcare centre. Jenny, do you want to go on to your example?
Thank you. So I've got an example here. It's based on a quote from an article by Charles Te Ahukaramu Royal. And this was something that the teachers were already using. I didn't introduce them in this kindergarten. They were already using these key Māori values. And I asked one of them, where did you get those values from? And it wasn't too much, that particular teacher didn't know. Later on, I recognized it as coming from this article. So that was quite interesting that this Charles Royal's article was in the kindergarten and something that was part of their philosophy already, not just something that the researcher wanted them to use. Anyway, the article has these Māori constructs, so I'll go through them. Rangatiratanga is concerned with leadership and defines leadership as the ability to bind, which is to rāranga, and groups, which are a tira as a group, binding the group together. A rangatira binds groups together, and a person who does not cannot be said to be a rangatira. So the teachers actively encouraged the children to demonstrate their rangatiratanga. They asked them to serve as a rangatira, a leader, and to demonstrate caring for others. And this beautifully involved younger children looking after older children. And in a little example of that, a younger child got accidentally knocked over when they were outside looking for bugs in the veggie garden. So one of the older children led this younger child who was quite upset inside, sat her down, got an ice pack from this low fridge that was accessible to children for this purpose, and sat with her. And then when the children were finished, the younger child got up, the older child, walking away, skipping away, actually tripped and fell quite heavily on the hard floor of the kindergarten. The younger child then went and got the ice pack and escorted the older child to sit down and gave her an ice pack. So there was this beautiful reciprocity, not just the presumption that only older children did the caring. Manaakitanga is another view, another Māori worldview, which is very pervasive, and it points to the mutual elevation of mana. So again, it's between everybody, not just certain people. So mana is power, prestige, and esteem, and it's heightened by your actions. So as one person or group encounters another, they will go through some kind of process. And if the outcome of that process sees the elevation of the mana of both parties, then it can be said that manaakitanga has been expressed. It's often translated as generosity, hospitality, caring, that sort of thing. And similarly, children's manaakitanga was being actively fostered by the teachers, encouraging them in that direction. Whanaungatanga, it comes from the word whānau, which is families or extended families. So to create whanaungatanga is to create a sense of being a family. But Charles's definition is that it denotes the interrelatedness of all things. And this is shown in whakapapa, which is the genealogical connectedness, which is very, very highly recognized in a Māori worldview. So an example of that was a wall display where they had featured, they'd been on a visit to a museum which had been showing the artifacts and history of the local iwi, which is the local tribe, which is Ngāti Toa Rangatira. So they had this wall display, and they had taken, it was actually quite cute, they'd taken photos of the children dressed in traditional Māori clothing, and that was photos of that were on the wall. But alongside that, there was a map of the world where children from India or any other country could show their connections to their international ancestral homes, which I thought was quite inclusive. And then tohungatanga, it's a tohunga is an expert. It's usually in a Māori community, it's handed down knowledge through the tohunga to the next generation of tohunga. In Charles's rendering, it concerns expertise and skill, particularly with symbols, with interpreting them, with creating new symbols whilst preserving old symbols. And so the teachers in this kindergarten were actively researching and including Māori and actually Pacific Island knowledges, because this particular kindergarten had both a high number of Māori and Pacific Islands children, and they were bringing these amazing things to me as the researcher that I wasn't aware of in terms of their research. So that was quite astounding to me at the time.
So in conclusion, yeah, we wonder if there might be more hope for the planet's future if more of us listen to the wisdom of Indigenous peoples. And in particular, we discuss in the paper, and we've given some illustrations of these concepts of relationality and trust and collective responsibility. And to do such, what is so important for decision makers is to accept their own vulnerability, to drop their guards of all-knowingness and be willing to share the decision making across generations. Thank you.
So we have a couple of references there, but you probably don't really need those. I'll end the PowerPoint. Stop the share.
Thank you very much, Louise and Jenny. That was really fascinating. I'm going to pass across now to our discussants, who will share some questions with us all and be putting them to the authors of each paper in turn. And Becky and Marion are going to take it in turns to ask a question of the authors. So we're going to begin with Becky, please.
Thanks, Jane. That's great. And just to say huge thanks to both groups of authors for those presentations. They're both fascinating and really complemented a really nice follow-up to having just recently reread the papers as well. So thank you for that. If it's okay with Anina and Steve, we're going to dive straight into a couple of sort of more methodological questions. The paper, Steve and Anina, uses a large data set of students' records, as you said, from across a number of local authorities, and presents findings from some really great in-depth statistical analysis. Could you tell us a little bit about what you feel those kind of approaches contribute to the field of education research, and maybe what you'd say to researchers who are interested in developing skills in that area?
Yeah, I think for me, the benefit is really grounding your research question in a thorough knowledge of what the relationships are between the factors that you're interested in your local context. So people often use EAL in England to mean sort of language learning need. And actually what the analysis shows is it doesn't indicate that largely at all. So there may be some small gaps at 5 associated with EAL compared to multilingual English speakers. But actually by 7, there's a small gap only remaining in English, no gap in maths. And then by 11, no gaps. And then by 16, young people who are recorded as EAL actually are achieving on average higher levels of success at school than young people recorded as monolingual English. So this kind of casual shorthand that people do, oh, EAL means language support need, is just wrong. So it's about really grounding your starting point in a knowledge of what's going on. So you launch off your research inquiry with a really solid understanding of what the phenomena is in your context. But then, of course, you can do really interesting things about particular hypotheses. So we use this EAL flag to target funding in the national funding formula, £500 for every young pupil identified as EAL in the first 3 years at school. And then we can actually say, well, let's look at this, because this is obviously an important variable. Then let's compare this versus an alternative conception about measuring young people's fluency in English, which is only important because it's the language of instruction in England. I mean, it's basically what we're really talking about is your competence in the language of instruction, and that will be a different language in different countries. But in England, okay, it's English. And then we can actually, compare the two. So you can make an empirical test, and then you can say, well, kind of, at what ages is there a difference in these predictors for young people from which kinds of backgrounds and whatever. So it allows you to both ground yourself solidly as a springboard for other forms of inquiry, and it also offers you some particular avenues to make comparisons of competing hypotheses or research questions that really dig in depth into the data that you have. So yeah, so I think it brings a number of benefits. That's not to say that other methods aren't valuable as well, but there's a particular role and a particular usefulness, I think, to that quantitative approach.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's really helpful to think about it in terms of grounding ourselves and really considering the kind of the concepts and the ideas and what it is that we are trying to study and how we do that. And if I may just follow up, the question about kind of how you would recommend people get involved with this kind of methodological work if they're interested is coming partly from a recent survey that I was involved with, which says that education researchers in the UK would be quite keen to learn more about using numerical approaches, but don't always know how to go about it. So I just wondered sort of what your reflections on that were as someone who was quite, very experienced in this field and thinking about how we would support your researchers coming in.
Well, certainly all researchers, not just PhD students, but master's students taking degrees in our department, my department, will get that training as part of their program. And that's not because we want everybody to be a quantitative researcher. They may not choose to use it in their own master's dissertation or indeed in their own PhD, but they need to be informed consumers of other people's research. So, I'm not doing this in a sort of evangelical way, but actually it's important to be able to decode the results of other people's research as well. So we give people a taster through our foundation training, research methods training modules. So we give them exposure to a whole range of methodologies. But hopefully that's a good springboard for further inquiry. If you move on, you know, some people have done that in their undergraduate degree as well, depending on what their background is. But we try and make sure that everybody that comes to do a master's in education gets that kind of training.
Thank you. That's great. Over to Marion.
Thanks. And again, yeah, thanks to all four presenters. I think the two presentations just show, you know, the wonders of the breadth of educational research and what it can tell us. So thanks very much. So I'm going to focus my first questions on the first paper. And this is because I'm essentially a nosy person and I'm always interested in like the backstory. So when I read a very brief sentence about not being able to get data from the Department of Education, I was just fascinated to know what was going on behind the scenes there, really, and how you as a research team kind of negotiated the problem of presumably not getting the data that you really wanted, and what do you think the kind of payoffs and drawbacks of the choice you eventually were forced to make were?
Yeah, well, I mean, we did some research funded by the Educational Endowment Foundation, looking at EAL and all the national data, a bit like we've reported, Anina's reported today, looking at achievement of 5, 7, 11, and 16, and trying to identify kind of what factors were those that were most associated with risk of low achievement for monolingual English children. Were they the same factors for young people who spoke English digital language? And it was very impactful in the sense that the department on the back of that said, right, we will introduce a measure of proficiency in English, because what we concluded from the research was that we weren't measuring the one thing that was absolutely central that you needed to know as a teacher, which is not whether this child was exposed to a language other than English in the early years, but actually what their current functioning proficiency was in English now, because that is how you access the whole of the curriculum, not just the English curriculum, but, you know, all of the curriculum in school. If you don't speak the language of school instruction, you can't access the curriculum. And so they actually introduced a measure. So it was great. We felt that, you know, there's my impact case study. But then I suppose the other piece of learning then was the vagaries of policy. So at the same time that they introduced the proficiency in English item, which, by the way, has been collected in Wales and in Scotland for about 20 years or so. So it's just England that wasn't collecting it. When they introduced that, they also introduced an item on country of birth, which was fairly uncontentious because we asked that in all sorts of surveys. But they also introduced a third item at the same time, which was the nationality of the young person. And that was quite contentious because it then became apparent that the Home Office had requested information from the Department of Education in trying to track down illegal entrance to the country. And so that information had in some cases been supplied by the DfE to the Home Office. And of course that caused quite a lot of contention, basically. The upshot of it was nobody objected to the proficiency in English item, but because all three of these items had been brought in by the same piece of legislation, they had to either all three remain or all three go. And so the department decided that because there had been such a bad response, that they would no longer collect it, and they wouldn't let any researchers have access to the data that they had collected, which to me was just a monumental waste of time, because why would you go ask every teacher in this country to make assessments of the proficiency in English of their EAL pupils and then not even allow any educational researchers to actually look at the data? So we decided that we would find a way of doing it, which is where we partnered with a kind of diverse range of local authorities and their schools to collect this large data set, which we could then analyze, and it was nationally representative, and it told us pretty much everything we needed to know. But it was about sort of showing that as a community, I suppose the engagement we did there was with people who were involved in education services and school improvement services and research and statistics services in local authorities up and down the country. And we engaged and worked with them and made presentations to them and to the teachers in their schools, head teachers particularly. And that work generated that people wanted to know what this data had shown and what this data might suggest about how well the financing that was being provided was targeted at the young people that really needed the additional support. And so we were able to circumvent, I suppose, in some ways, the denial by the DFE of the data by actually the community came together and we shared the data. And so we were able to do it. So, yeah, beware policymakers. Sometimes, it's what looks like a great outcome isn't ultimately as successful as you might want.
Thanks. That's such an interesting response. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Mary. The next thing we were interested to pick up on, Steve and Anina, is around the bilingual language exposure that you spent a little time discussing in the paper, and I thought it was really interesting that came through. And Anina, in your presentation, you were just referring to the importance of understanding monolingualism as well. And we just wondered if you could sort of speak a little more to those issues and how they sort of connect in with your findings and maybe to other work related to this as well.
I mean, if Anina wants to come in at any point, what we agreed beforehand was that she would do the presentation and I would ask the questions. So I'm not, if you want to come in at any time, Anina, please feel free to do so. But just sticking to our original plan, then I'll answer that as well. But then I'll hand over to you if you've got anything to add. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what we found was a measure of exposure, whether you had been exposed to a language other than English in the early years, either at home or in the community is the definition, and regardless of your proficiency in English. That kind of exposure measure just isn't, as you can imagine, very powerful in trying to understand how well young people are coping with the curriculum, because you may be, in our case, basically you could be a new entrant from another country who speaks absolutely no English, okay? Or you could be a young person, which is quite common in England, who speaks, is exposed to another language at home, but speaks English perfectly fluently and basically has, as part of their cultural heritage, another language, but that has no implications for their ability to communicate and their fluency in English. And they can switch between languages and they can function really well. So that measure of exposure, it just isn't getting at the kind of key thing that's associated with how well you're doing at school. So, I mean, you see that very clearly. So all the young people on the graphs that Anina showed in the first set of graphs were EAL, yeah, and yet those who were fully fluent were scoring above the monolingual English average, where those who were new to English were scoring right down at the lower levels. So, it's quite apparent straight away that exposure isn't the important thing. What's important is actually your ability to negotiate the curriculum through the language of instruction.
Yeah.
And actually being bilingual can be a real asset. We must get away from any kind of deficit notion about this, because if you're fluent in both English and in another language, that offers you some advantages. I mean, it's certainly in terms of like kind of meta language awareness about how languages work, and also often a language about languages. So you could talk about things like grammar and word order and in a way that gives you an ability to reflect on language, which often as a monolingual speaker, you just don't have. You don't have the kind of conceptual tools to express or discuss language. So yeah, very much it can be an asset, bilingualism, but also can be an indication that you need support, which is kind of not really a surprise. If I moved to France and I was having to go to school and learn in French, I would need a lot of support because I don't speak any French,
Yeah.
Any
Yeah, just to add to that, like as Steve very nicely explained, we've always known that there's been a diversity within bilingualism, right? And what we very often see is when you put like the dots of all people's language abilities next to each other, and you have the monolinguals and you have the bilinguals, the bilinguals, that you have a wider spread. You might have the recently moved to France, Steve, but you also might have the person who always grew up in England and, is really fluent in it. And there's always been an overlap between the graphs. An interesting thing is you'll get some people who are growing up with two languages, but because of many reasons, and they can be varied, where your bilingualism is going to a really high level. They can be much higher than many monolingual learners. For example, in my school, we have a lot of students from very low socioeconomic backgrounds, and you don't have to be bilingual to have problems getting complex sentences together, knowing a lot of words, understanding texts that you could normally expect someone to read at age 11. And then at the same time, we have students who learn to read and write in Arabic, and bring a lot of literacy skills. And as Steve said, that is also meta knowledge that you gain that you can then use. So I think for that reason, it's really important not only to have observable behaviors that you compare kids against, because that you as a teacher, you then know what to compare someone to, and that works for everybody, no matter monolingual or bilingual, but also to do that for all kinds of learners, because there are many reasons why you can be good at a language or not good.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Really interesting to hear that exchange. I'm thinking, Becky, if you'd like to move across to our runners-up paper.
Sure, Jane. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, conscious of time. Thank you, Steve and Anina, for those responses. That's really interesting. Right, yes, it's me again, starting with the other paper. So I wanted to pick up first of all here on this idea of collective identity. This comes through really strongly in this paper, and it's sort of fascinating the way it's discussed. I just wondered if you could say a little more about the significance of that concept for you as researchers, but also for your participants as well, and just asking you to think a little bit about things that you think researchers, education organisations, communities around the world can learn from this idea of the collective or collective identity.
Sure, so I'll start off. I think Western education researchers tend to take as their unit of analysis the individual child, and this is partly engineered by our assessment systems that require this form of attention to monitoring progress across, learning outcomes for the individual child. And yet we have, other researchers and sociocultural theorists such as Lev Vygotsky, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and Barbara Rogoff have acknowledged that this individualized focus is really an artificial construction. And that's been well recognized by Indigenous people for whom the unit of analysis is the collective. And it, as we've been talking about, is of the extended multi-generational family. In our case, in Aotearoa, the whānau family, and the hapu, the sub-tribe, and the iwi, the tribe. So in sourcing their identity within this wider collective, Māori children, for example, they're affirmed in their identities as contributors to the community, and that is part of their mana that I was talking about earlier, and that is what actually enables their pride to be successful, if you like. And part of that is because the contribution to the community enhances the mana of both themselves and their community. So that's a very powerful motivation. And it's, again, we want to remind Western thinkers that this community is not just the human, but it's our other earthly and spiritual entities. So it's quite a different worldview, and I think it's a useful one for people to realize that there is value within that.
Thanks, Jenny. Louise, did you want to add anything there? You might be on mute. Sorry, Louise.
I'll answer the next question.
Sure, I think that's me again. I think it's kind of a follow-up as well. So yeah, we felt that the paper did a really great job of kind of highlighting the importance of children's voices and their participation in research, but also thinking about that in relation to policy and practice, as you note in the paper. And we wondered if you could say a little bit more about your experiences of working in that space, but also what you see as some of the challenges as well as the benefits of doing that work.
Yes, yeah. So like Indigenous peoples, children, there's a lot of work that's been research on, though sociology of childhood has done significant work in catalyzing our rethinking, and that we to engage and work with children as informed and agential others. And some of the ways that we did that in this project. So, for example, found child-friendly cameras so that they were also active participants in the data collection. And I also found a video camera that could project back. So it had a feature to project on the wall. So we could show the footage that I filmed and then share on the wall. And then as a group, we could, sit and discuss that data with the children. And what were some other examples? I did drop some notes from, remember it's 5 a.m. now. And in sharing back to them was catalyze these really rich conversations, but also the choices of what data we use. So like Jenny gave that example as well, like I was sharing footage to get their consent, but asking them to, one idea, we asked them to take photos of the examples around in the centre of what they don't like, of what, they feel uncomfortable about. And resonant images that I recall now were of the open plan toilets. Yeah, so in near childcare centres, there's no privacy there. There's like 3 or something in an open room, and locked storage rooms. So, these were, really interesting, because some of these children had their language ability. So there was one child who'd had, experienced extreme neglect and was really just starting to get to develop those skills to work with the others, but really had a profound speech impediment, recurrent otitis media, so the blocked ears, and also challenges with the configuration in his mouth. And so he didn't have those skills to talk. So the images actually helped to communicate, and he was a very enthusiastic user of the cameras as well. And maybe it's another little example of the trust building with them as well, because it's so important to build the trust with the children so that they are comfortable, because it's the research is with them and for them. So this child, he was new to the centre and carried a bag with him the whole time that had some of his belongings. And he actually, at one point, he came and put the bag down next to me and went off to go and play an emergent game of soccer or football. And the educators just turned around, wow, that's the first time, he's done that. And, because I spent that time of, really honouring and spending time and valuing what he had to contribute. So he dropped the bag, and then he just did a quick look back at me, and I gave him the thumbs up, and he knew that the bag was safe with me. So hopefully that gives some illustrative examples there.
It really does. Yeah, that's brilliant.
Jenny, did you want to add any more there?
No, I'll answer the next question.
Over to Marion for the next question.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'd be interested in firstly in your reflections on the differences and similarities between the Australian and and Aotearoa New Zealand kind of backgrounds in terms of the extent to which Indigenous perspectives are incorporated within education, because I'm sure there are differences. And I've got another little add-on question, which is particularly thinking of the current political situation in Aotearoa New Zealand, and their attempts to kind of row back on Indigenous rights. So just really your reflections on that, the two of you. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to start, and Louise is going to follow. So we've had here in both countries histories of colonization by Britain, but different histories. In Aotearoa, we had a British education system that excluded Māori from high school education for a long time, for example. But the past 50 years has seen, after Māori had been trying to get this attention since the 1840 treaty that allowed British settlement, to the promises of equality in that treaty, Māori finally got recognition in 1975 of that treaty in legislation. And that has seen a growing validation through policy mandates of the importance of their language and culture, and inclusion of that in education. But you know, it's very variable how that's been applied in different education settings. We have these self-governing schools in New Zealand, for example, which mean that there's a local curriculum. Last year, for the very first time, all the schools in Aotearoa were required to teach an Aotearoa histories curriculum, and that included acknowledgement of colonization and local tribal histories. However, we've just had one of those reversals of government, and the current government that's been had 1 year in office now has completely abandoned commitments to Māori. It's just been a shockingly, extremely quick reversion. And so we now have a very constraining 3 R's education policy focused on 1 hour a day of reading, writing, and mathematics. The 3 R's are back. And some of the examples of how that's been impacting are a reallocation of funding that was provided to support all teachers to do Māori language, an online Māori language program. That money has now been taken away, and it's going to be funding commercially produced mathematics resources. I have a PhD student who's a primary school teacher, and she's shocked that not only are these things happening, but immediately she's now been told she can't use Māori examples in her mathematics teaching. That's how quickly and pervasively the whole focus for Māori equity has been removed. Another example is the Aotearoa Histories curriculum. It's now going to be revised to be more balanced, and more balanced means probably taking out the emphasis on Māori content. And what is actually interesting, though, we just had the most massive, you may have even heard about it in the news, protest against our government in history of New Zealand, against some of the anti-Māori, anti-treaty policies. So, and the people that are leading this protest movement are young Māori who've come through Māori immersion education, and they're extremely confident and articulate in both English and Māori languages and worldviews. So that's quite a fascinating pan-Māori, but also a lot of non-Māori resistance to what the government's doing. So it's quite an interesting time. A key difference here from Australia is that the Māori, there are dialects of the Māori language, but they are sufficiently similar that different tribes can understand one another. And we now have, and because of that kind of sort of standardization of Māori, there are a lot of resources now for teaching Māori language and so forth in schools. But as I mentioned, you know, the self-governing schools policy that we've had probably for about 30 years now means that the individual schools can dictate the extent to which Māori content is taught, and the potential for this to be done well is now being minimised due to this government mandate for the 3 R's. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks. Yeah, so in Australia, yeah, there are 300 plus, you know, different Aboriginal languages, so which there can't be that consistency of a universal language approach. And of course, yeah, completely the, as you would be aware, abhorrent history of decimating the culture and the language and the peoples. And so to give a context of what, where we're at now, there is a national policy that mandates, so the Mparntwe Education Declaration, so that governments commit. So there's education is a state responsibility. So each of the states and territories, that governments, to ensure all children learn about the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, and to see all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children thrive in their education and all facets of their life. So in terms of what really happens then in early childhood and school education, or some examples, I would say most would be enacting the cultural protocol of acknowledgement of country at all gatherings at the start of the day. And we have a cross-curriculum priority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and histories. And so what that looks like throughout the day, they would draw from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature, animation, films, visual art, performing arts, and bring in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges into sciences, such as backburning as a practice to control and so there isn't bushfires, but also to spark the new growth, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander astrology and things about the seasons. But like Jenny, for example, there can be this progress that happens, but then a Conservative government will come in and you go 10 steps backwards. So in Queensland, we've just had a Conservative government come in, and we've finally had some traction. So I hope you're aware, last year there was a national referendum for a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to government, but that was voted no, which was just absolutely devastating. And in Queensland, we had a Labor government, and they had to set up a truth-telling and healing inquiry, which is so important to work through, so we really disrupt the epistemic racism at play. So we have this truth-telling and healing inquiry, and they had really just started in July. And then the new government has come in and axed it. So saying that we know we don't want any division, is their thinking, and we will at this completely white group of members of parliaments, we know how to govern Aboriginal people, which is absolutely devastating. And even yesterday, the leader of the opposition for the at the federal level said he was not going to stand in front of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags anymore when he does press speeches. So yeah, it's a fraught space, and I just for my sisters and brothers, Aboriginal sisters and brothers, I just feel for them. Like, they must be so exhausted of the fight. You get somewhere and then you get knocked 10 steps back again. So that's the context.
Thanks. That was just, I think it's really great to get that sort of meat on the bones and to get a dynamic, up-to-date kind of picture. Thank you. That's really useful. Jane, are you going to move things? I know we're
I was. Thank you, Marion, because thank you for you and Becky for those really wonderful questions and the discussion that they sparked. I really, it's really brilliant listening to that. So I would now like to invite others in the audience if they'd like to put a question to our panel. So I'm opening the floor up to other participants. I shall look for if anybody wants to raise a hand or simply to unmute. We're quite a small group, so do feel that you can unmute if you'd like to pose a question. I'll try and look along. Don't see a hand raised.
Perhaps I can throw in my general question,
yeah,
which I
yeah.
have to everybody, which
Yeah.
was both your papers talk about, you know, the need for change, really, or the need for support from government or policy makers or practitioners to implement your recommendations. And I was just interested to hear the four of your reflections on how positive or negative or optimistic or pessimistic you felt about the prospects for achieving the types of change you recommend.
Shall I go first? Yeah. So as you'll be aware, we're seeing mostly, apart from in Syria recently, but elsewhere, we're seeing the rise of authoritarian governments and the sort of casting aside of what have been traditional democratic values and a focus on human rights or even caring for the environment. We see the Paris Agreement continually being watered down, and our current government is actually seemingly priding itself here in Aotearoa on dismissing advice from officials and experts and openly flaunting long-standing democratic conventions of due process, of having 3 stages of readings of new legislation, just rushing things through. You know, it's just the fast track government. And a lot of that has been retracting previous commitments to Māori, as I mentioned earlier, but also protections for the environment. Last week, we just had the social sciences removed from eligibility from the only government research funding body, the Marsden Research Fund. So here in Aotearoa, we're in just such a policy climate. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, we're also seeing this counter narrative coming forward of resistance and bringing people together. And I think my response is really that we need to, you know, collectively strategize, communicate, collaborate. I was at a meeting last week with the Early Childhood and Primary Teachers Union, just doing exactly that, and to generate an alternative vision. I've been emailing the left-wing parties saying, what's your alternative vision? What's your collective vision? Get it out there. And then we need to bring our education communities, parents, children, young people, and others on board. I think, you know, one thing that I was in the US for 2 months earlier this year, August, September, and I was just so concerned that I could see that this narrative that Harris was putting forward was just being ignored by people who get their information from social media and don't recognize disinformation. I think a key role for education is to foster this critical analysis, critical consciousness, so that children are realizing that they have the capacity to identify and critique disinformation, particularly in social media milieu. And we need to promote these counter narratives that are coming from children and young people and teachers and parents. One example that we can support is the climate school strikes for climate movement. That's been a global example of just what I've been talking about: strategizing, collaboration, counter narratives, activism. And I think if education scholars, researchers, and teachers support those capacities for that kind of advocacy, I think that can be a key counter to what we're seeing in terms of the erosion of democracy.
Thank you for that, Jenny. Is there would Anina or Steve have anything they'd like to add?
Well, just to say that despite the election results in the States and clearly from Louise in Queensland as well, we've just had a change of government, but in a much more optimistic vein. So, and we have to be careful, I suppose, that people's optimism can quite rapidly turn to pessimism over the course of a fairly short time period. So things are a bit bumpy for the incoming Labour government here. But nevertheless, after 14 years of a Conservative rule, I think there is a feeling that the government is generally open to change and thinking quite radically about doing things differently from the way we've been doing it for the last 15 years. So actually, it feels quite positive. It feels like a moment of opportunity, really, to sort of reflect on things in a positive way. So hopefully hopefully we'll have something positive to say about the education and change to education in this country, even whilst recognising everything you say about other parts of the world, not in fact going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, and I just reflected on the situation in Germany, which is, I think, quite different from the English system in that education is much more regionalized. So it's much harder for a national government to make a change, and you need much more of a grassroots or bottom-up approach to change. And I do think that at least on the regional level, there's quite a bit of room. There's recently been announced that there will be more funding for language education and coming up with programs for how to support teachers. I know, especially in this region, I'm in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is just on the west basically, and we've got a very multilingual group here. Lots of big cities, Cologne and Bonn and Düsseldorf. And there are a lot of people here, a lot of institutions that are partly state-funded, partly non-governmental, also university-led, some of them, that are quite active in putting forward changes in policy. And I feel quite optimistic that not only in individual schools, but also in broader groups of schools, there will be some change.
Thank you
So maybe
all.
one thing, and that we've had in Aotearoa, we've had a Māori immersion schooling movement for about 35 years. And the graduates of that are now the sort of really articulate leaders. And we have some of them having been elected to Parliament. And you may have also seen recently that Hana Rāwhiti Maipi Clark led a haka against the passing into the first stage of being read of an anti-treaty bill. And that just was so widely reported because this young Māori woman stood up in our Parliament and did this impressive haka, accompanied by others and those in the gallery. And I think that generation are not going to take the oppression that has been the experience of their forebears lying down. And one other point around that is that the Māori medium schooling, only 3% of Māori children get access to that. But the research from that very limited population shows that Māori children achieve really well when they have a Māori medium. And when I say Māori medium, it's not just the language, it's the whole culture and values that I mentioned earlier. And yet the governments have successive governments, in keeping the proportion of Māori children able to access that to 3%. So that's quite an indictment.
Thank you all once more. I am conscious of time, but there was one very quick question that has struck me. And I didn't know if anybody, any of our authors would have any reflections on it. And I was just thinking about the implications of your, different research studies in relation to teacher education, what we could take from these findings in terms of, if you could wave a magic wand, what might you add in terms of thinking about the ingredients for teacher education? Do you think? Don't know if anybody would want to.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, absolutely that, the learning from Indigenous wisdom, to be embedded in teacher education. And so we have in Australia, in all teacher education programs, there is an Aboriginal, culture unit. So that's mandated. Which is, that's fairly recent and is so important because as teachers in Australia, we are guests all here, and it is an absolute imperative that we honour and enact those ontologies and knowledges. So that I see is incredibly important.
Yeah, slightly more positive than some of the other things that we've heard. So
Yes.
I don't know. Yes, Steve.
Well, just the predominant model still for teacher training is university-based teacher training, and that's what young people coming into teaching really want, despite the government trying to undermine it at every kind of stage, the previous government, I should say. But it is a very finite amount of time, and actually in that year, they spend, 80% of that out in schools learning, how to negotiate, but performing in the classroom and everything else. And so they don't have a lot of time for other things. So you've got to really think about continuing professional development rather than what can
Right.
you squeeze into that first year, because actually they're just overwhelmed, really. But that's where the local authority is really important, I think, in terms of reflecting local need and actually continuing to support teachers over their developing career, really.
Yeah. And Nina, sorry, I overcut as well because I wasn't sure if you wanted to come in too. Thanks for that, Steve.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. I think continuing professional development is super important. Also just for the simple reason that there continues to be change, like AI will keep bringing change into the education system, and you can't prepare people for what will come over the next decades. I also think when you have more time, like you do in the German school system, where it's more like 6.5 years in total, then what Steve said earlier about quantitative methods on a lower level, but like training people to understand language test results or test results in general, because there's so much testing being done on schools, and particularly for language education, you need a certain, like a basic level of being able to tell when a test is good and how you can use it for teaching. And then also general awareness and some level of skill across subjects for how to teach not only the subject but also the language of instruction. And I think what I forgot who of you it was, Louise or Jenny, but you also mentioned that it's not only about the language but also about understanding the intercultural perspective that comes in. I think that would be really valuable too.
Well, thank you for that. It just remains for me really to extend my warm thanks once more to all of you for the wonderful and rich research that you've all been engaged on and writing for us at this journal, and encouraging you all to think about educational review for future work, but also just to thank you once more and the discussants for such a really, really rich discussion that I and I'm sure everybody here, I got so much from. It was really wonderful hearing those reflections. So thank you so much.